My name is Elizabeth Radow. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Larchmont-Mamroneck. Welcome to the Forum on New York Unfunded Mandates in an Era of Tax Caps, Problems, and Possible Solutions. A little over 1 year ago, at a League of Women Voters breakfast, Senator George Latimer discussed aspects of New York property tax law which provided the impetus for tonight's event. Specifically, we learned that New York is the only state in America to fund its Medicaid program in part from property tax dollars, a practice which is not sustainable given the opportunity of New York's growing older adult population to access Medicaid funding. The discussion evolved to include the challenges of unfunded state mandates under existing law. As the county with the dubious distinction of having the highest property tax, we decided to bring these issues to you. Thanks to a collaboration between the League of Women Voters and the Summit, we have an excellent program planned. Special thanks and congratulations to Judy Silberstein, who worked closely with the Summit to make tonight possible. Judy is with her daughter's family tonight, celebrating the birth of her granddaughter Talia, who was born in the wee hours of Election Day. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization which encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Tonight's program embodies all of these goals. Tonight's event is funded in part by the League of Women Voters of Westchester's Education Fund. We are grateful for their support. I'd like to give special thanks to Barbara Bartoletti, coming from Albany, to be here this evening. This program is being taped by LMC-TV with the intention of sharing it widely with other League of Women Voters chapters throughout the state and other organizations throughout the state. Thank you all for being here. I would now like to turn this over to Elaine Chapnick, President of the Summit.
Good evening. I, too, want to welcome all of you here. As you have heard, I'm Elaine Chapnick, President of the Larchmont-Mamroneck Local Summit. The Local Summit is not an advocacy organization. We do not take any positions, nor do we do any lobbying. Our mission is to bring people together to learn about important issues that affect our community. We encourage those who attend our meetings to consider solutions and then take whatever action they deem necessary, either individually or in cooperation with other community groups. Tonight, we are most fortunate to have an outstanding and experienced moderator for our forum, Karen Schatzel. Karen has been a member of the League of Women Voters since the early 1970s and has served in leadership roles in the Irvington, Greenberg, and County Leagues. At present, she is a member of the River Towns League of Women Voters and serves as a president and director of housing of the League of Women Voters of Westchester, the umbrella for the 10 local leagues in Westchester. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Schatzel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Is this working now? It is, okay. And thank you for inviting me to participate. Like you, I am looking forward to learning more about mandates and hopefully what we can do about some of them. We have 5 outstanding speakers tonight who are all going to be speaking about different aspects of mandates. And they have been asked to speak for not more than 8 to 10 minutes each. We recognize that especially when one is speaking, one can lose track of the time. So we have someone in the first row, is that right? And we are just going to, thank you. She's holding up a 2-minute sign and a 1-minute sign. And obviously, we're not going to ask anyone to leave if they go over their time. But on the other hand, we would ask you to be mindful of the time when you're speaking and just be alert to those signs when they come up.
Is there only one sign, 2 and 1? Is that
There's
it?
a 2-minute sign and a 1-minute sign, okay? Our first speaker is going to be Valerie O'Keefe. I was told before the meeting tonight that I don't have to really introduce her because everybody here knows her anyway. But I have been given a short biography, so I would like to read it for those of us who don't know Mrs. O'Keefe. For many years, Valerie Moore O'Keefe has been a prominent and well-known member of the Larchmont-Mamroneck community. She served on the Mamaroneck Town Council from 1994 to 2000 and was then elected town supervisor, a position she served in until 2011. In addition to her responsibilities on the town board and as town supervisor, Ms. O'Keefe served as a trustee and chairperson of the Westchester Municipal Officials Association, that was in year 2007, as president of the Westchester Putnam Association of Town Supervisors in 2008, on the board of directors of the Westchester Holocaust Education Center from 2011 to the present time, and on the board of directors of the Catholic Guardian Society and Home Bureau. Ms. O'Keefe is a graduate of Manhattanville College and received her law degree from the George Washington University Law School. She is a member of the New York State Bar Association and Westchester County Bar Association. She has served as a trustee for both Manhattanville College and the Convent of the Sacred Heart. Ms. O'Keefe is going to be speaking on what are mandates and what are their impacts. Ms. O'Keefe.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Well, for the purposes of our discussion tonight, a mandate is simply legislation, state policy, or regulations that impose costs upon local government. Local governments are agencies which include towns, villages, cities, counties, school districts, and special districts like the town of Mamaroneck's fire district. Mandated costs imposed by the state inevitably appear in local government budgets. Mandates are a means by which the state can transfer the costs of programs and regulations that the state deems appropriate to another level of government. In that way, it does not appear in the New York State budget. A large expenditure for a mandate, such as Medicaid, rather than accounted for in full in the state budget, is spread over county governments' budgets throughout the state, and therefore the totality of the impact is never addressed. Because the state is never accountable for the full expense, since all or a portion of the funding comes from local government. But what we do in New York State, the federal government pays 50%, and then 49 other states, the state pays the other 50%, not New York. The New York State pays 25%, and then they push the other 25% down upon the counties. And how does the county get the money? It gets it by giving you property tax. So you're funding medical care for less affluent people on property tax, not income tax. In other states, it could be excise taxes, income taxes, who knows what kind of taxes, but it's not on the property tax except for the Empire State. The question of the fairness and impact of mandates has become more and more of a hot-button issue since the state imposed the tax cap legislation. Local officials and leaders know that the tax cap, large part of the function, I've lost myself. Okay, we know it's unsustainable. The tax cap is unsustainable, and that is in large part a function of New York State mandates. As most of you know by now, the tax cap limits the amount of property taxes that can be levied. When the state established the tax cap legislation, it did not exempt from the calculation the cost of mandates. So they tell you have a tax cap, but they keep mandating you to spend more money. The tax cap legislation was a blanket restriction upon the amount of funding that can be raised through the property tax, which, by the way, is a form of tax that the state does have to rely on for any of its, doesn't have to for itself for any of its programs or activities. So what then are the most significant mandates that affect local government like the town of Mamaroneck? The most controversial of the mandates of the last several years has been the cost of New York State pensions. Now, pension costs have been included in municipal budgets for many years. This is not necessarily a discussion of whether one is for or against public pensions. It has been the way in which the pension is managed and how costs have increased dramatically. Local government has virtually no control over how the costs are funded for pensions. Local governments in New York State don't have a choice about participating in the pension system. Under state law, pension participation must be offered to all employees, even part-time employees, who work 15 or 20 hours a week. Also, the local government has no discretion to negotiate with its employees' pension contribution rates. The local government must bear the full cost of the contribution as dictated by the state. Another troublesome mandate for local government is the Triborough Amendment. The act, which was adopted in 1982, prohibits public employers from altering any provision of an expired contract or labor agreement. This has the effect of requiring automatic pay increases where a step salary system is in place, even though the contract's expired. So the contract expires, and the people still keep getting increases, even though there's been no contract signed. So that doesn't incent, let's say, the unions to negotiate in good faith, because they can just sit there and sit there and sit there, and the people are still their people are going to get increases. With this requirement in place, there is less motivation for a union to negotiate a new contract if they know that some portion of their membership will continue to receive pay raises. New York State is the only state known to have this type of legislation. Also in the category of employee relations is the extension, excuse me, from age 62 to age 68, the mandatory retirement age for police and firefighters. Now, an overwhelming number of police and firefighters participate in 20-year pension plans. This means greater pension contribution costs on a higher salary budget compared with lower pension costs associated with newly hired employees. I mean, if you keep working until you're 68 as a fireman, it's kind of scary. Another point to be remembered is that when an older population of emergency responders the greater the likelihood of job-related injuries, which increase workers' compensation costs. Another mandated cost for local governments. We have to pay the workers' compensation costs. The idea of somebody 25 getting hurting his back, getting out of a police car, is much less than somebody 65. In terms of government operations, the Wicks law probably stands out as one of the most difficult state mandates. Dating back to 1912, the Wicks law requires governments in New York State to divide construction projects into a minimum of 5 separate contracts. You can't hire one contractor and let him go out and get the carpenter, the electrician, the HVAC, and all that. You've got to have 5 separate contracts with 5 separate trade unions or tradesmen. This Wicks law leaves the responsibility for coordinating the various contractors and the overall construction process. Somebody's got to watch over all these people. Now, generally, local governments don't have this type of expertise. That means that we have to hire a consultant or a contractor to oversee the whole thing, which adds more expense. Added expenses to coordinate the project. Now, the Wicks law also tends to generate more litigation as contractors sue local governments over project delays. One contractor finishes his work, contractor B doesn't finish his work, contractor A wants to get paid, but we don't finish the project, so we have more litigation. Studies done on the impact of the Wicks law indicate that the projects can be as much as 20% higher for municipal construction projects in New York. If you just went across to Connecticut or to New Jersey, the same set of circumstances, the same kind of stuff, 30% cheaper. Then there are a host of other smaller mandates that local government must address each day and account for in their budgets, having to do with government operations. The answer to all of this is for the state of New York to address meaningful mandate relief and remove those laws and regulations that attempt to micromanage local government. Legislative actions must include a full financial analysis to determine the true impact upon local property taxes if the legislation is adopted in Albany. State-mandated costs should be exempted from the tax cap formula to ensure that local governments are not held accountable for costs that they can't control at all. To be fair in this discussion, I should point out that the governor has established a commission to study state mandates, and some very small changes have been made, but none that will have any significant impact upon local government budgets. Local government budgets should be about the expenses that provide service to the local community, and not about expenses transferred from the state to the local government. I do have a chart, and I'm just looking from 1998 to 2014. The pension cost in the town of Mamaroneck in 1998 was $339,000. Then it went to, in 2003, $400,000. 2011, $1,800,000. 2012, $2,200,000. 2013, $2,600,000, and projected now, it's going to be $2,738,000 from 1998. It's a continuous graph going up. The Medicare reimbursement that we have to pay in 2011, $127,000, 2012, $130,000, $134,000 last year, now $145,000 for next year. Keeps going up. Now, the workers' compensation goes from 1998, goes to $277, this is every couple of years, to $229, it went down. Then in 2011, it was $500,000. Then it went down again to $440,000 in 12. Now it's up to, last year, $519,000. Next year, it's going to be $600,000. We have no control over these costs, and we don't get any relief from the state. So the other thing is, it bothers me, is what they call spiking. You know, in New York State, unlike our two neighboring states, you can work, the way we do it is the 3 most successful years you have, your pension is based on that. That's not true in New Jersey. It's not true in Connecticut. So if you can, you're a school janitor, you see in New York City, they claim to work 90 hours. In the last 2 or 3 years, they're making $250,000. They have pensions in the range of $150,000, $170-something thousand. You see that also with the policemen in Rockland County. I don't see any problem with letting people work more and getting the money for the overtime work, but the pension should not be based upon this spiking by calculating the pension on the added overtime.
Thank you.
That's my
Thank you, Ms.
spiel.
O'Keefe.
Thank you.
I just learned a new term, spiking, so I hope you all took note of that also. Our next 2 speakers are as well known to the audience as is Ms. O'Keefe. And our second speaker is going to be George Latimer. George Latimer is a longtime resident of the Sound Shore community and has been a familiar political figure in the Sound Shore for many years. Since 2012, he has represented the 37th Senate District in the New York State Senate. Prior to that, from 2004 to 2012, Senator Latimer was the assemblyman for the 91st Assembly District. Excuse me. Senator Latimer also served as a member of the Westchester County Board of Legislators from 1992 to 2004, serving as its chairman from 1998 to 2004. In addition, Senator Latimer served on the Rye City Council from 1988 through 1991. Currently, Senator Latimer is a member of the following Senate committees: Consumer Protection, Environmental Conservation, Local Government, Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities, Racing, Gaming, and Wagering, and Infrastructure and Capital Investment. Senator Latimer was awarded a Bachelor of Arts from Fordham University and went on to acquire an MPA from the Wagner School at NYU. Before entering the public sector, Senator Latimer was a marketing executive for a number of different corporations, including AT&T, IT&T, IBM, Nestle, and Shearson Lehman. Senator Latimer.
Sounds to me like this guy can't hold a job. Our challenge tonight, and we appreciate those of you who came out to hear us go through this stuff, because this is oftentimes not the most interesting or exciting conversation. Most people begin with the premise that we all agree. We pay higher property taxes here than we pay anyplace else, and we don't want to pay high property taxes. And don't tell me a whole lot more about it, because it is complicated and takes up my time and effort. I have a family to raise. I have a business career to run. I have my interests and my avocation. Those of you who are here tonight are to hear some of why things are the way they are, and more importantly, what we can do about them, what is possible to do, understanding that we are in a world, a governmental world, a political world, a real world, where there are conflicting interests that compete against each other. And when one person says do the right thing, it can often mean a 180-degree opposite of somebody else telling you do the right thing. For those of us who understand the problems of property taxes and what it means at a local government level, do the right thing is opposed by people who have different interests at the table. Basically, my challenge tonight is to touch base on what state mandates mean at a county government level. As Karen was kind enough to say, I spent 13 years in the Westchester County Legislature representing Larchmont-Mamroneck and Rye, and I had 4 years to serve as chairman of the Board of Legislators, which put me directly involved in the budgetary structure and process of the county government. So I'm going to channel my inner Don Draper from Mad Men, and I'm going to go to make a little presentation to you that has a few notes that you can see the way I jotted it down when I was working on it. There is a report. Is this on, by the way? Can you hear me in here through this?
No.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2. That we're good now. There's a report that's been done by the New York State Association of Counties, and you can access it yourself. If you have insomnia later tonight, I'm sure it will cure that. www.nisac.org, and there's a report that was done 2 years ago that outlined the basic areas of mandates as affect county governments, not just Westchester County, but every county in the state. And while Westchester has always identified as having the highest property taxes, it does not correlate to the government of the county of Westchester. It is the aggregate of all of the property taxes that are paid here. That fact is lost when we talk about Westchester, the place, and we assume it's a direct correlation to the county government of Westchester, because the reality of it is there are a number of different areas that are affected. Let me just briefly touch, and I know I've only got 8 minutes, some of the categories and what the statewide impacts of mandates are, as identified 2 years ago. Some of these things have been slightly modified in the last year. The impact of a Medicaid mandate from the state of New York, $7 billion of mandated cost to all counties aggregate around New York State. Public assistance and safety net policies, an impact of $1 billion. Child welfare, protection, and prevention, impact of $800 million. Those are huge numbers that we're talking about. I'm going to jump down to what Valerie was talking about, the impact of pensions, a system run by New York State, $600 million. Preschool, special ed, indigent defense, probation, early intervention, youth detention. We've just finished an electoral process where people say, what does the county government do? What do I see that Westchester County does? If you are involved in indigent defense, you might see the cost that that's involved with. But if you're not involved in that particular service, you wouldn't know that. But it is a task that has been assigned to the county government by the state of New York. And in addition to that, that there are probationary responsibilities for those who have committed crimes, who are now on release after completing their debt to society, but still have to be monitored. If you or a member of your family have not been involved in the criminal justice system in that way, you don't see the county government's role in providing probation services. But obviously, it's a necessary service that's provided. And then many of these other things, preschool special ed, which is one of those issues that has been debated more this year, the public assistance safety net. If you are not in those programs, the cost of what the county has been mandated to do is a phenomenal amount of money, and that is the bulk of what your county property taxes go to. You might know that the county bus system is something that you see as county service. You might not see that the collection of your garbage done by the Village of Larchmont, the Village of Mamaroneck, the Joint Sanitation Commission here between Mamaroneck Town and Larchmont Village and in other communities is a municipal service. But the point of collection is not the most expensive part of it. That gets taken to a transfer station, from the transfer station to the point of reducing it at Charles Point or recycling it at the MRF. All of those things is the more expensive part, and you don't see that. And those are parts of things that are mandated to the county government. Let's talk about what it means to you, the individual, to have this situation. In county government and all other governments, and I'm generalizing numbers here, you can certainly quibble with some of them because they're generalized numbers. if you pay $20,000 in property taxes, now if you pay $10,000, half these numbers. If you pay $40,000, double these numbers. And you can do whatever mental calculation you'd like off of this general number. General number, $20,000 in property taxes, you're paying somewhere in the vicinity of 20% of it to your local government. Your village and town combined, if you live in the village of Larchmont or the village of Mamroneck. To your town alone, if you live outside of the two villages, if you live in a city like New Rochelle or Rye, to your city government. 4,000 out of that 20,000 is municipal. 4,000 of it, another 20% goes to the county government. 12,000 of it, 60% goes to the school district. There's slight nuance in there, 62% here, 17% here, but in round numbers, when we talk about what the cost of your property taxes are, most people don't really see the breakdown. They know they pay $20,000 in property taxes. You hear a lot of debate about we should merge villages and towns. This is already a merged number, this $4,000. So when people say we could save a lot of money, we could merge the village, we could merge the town, whatever discussions those aren't necessarily going to be driven around a major reduction in your property taxes. And that's where the devil is in the details. And sometimes those of us who are in government, we get so close to the details, we forget that the average person, intelligent average person, does not understand that. They think there's wild wasting of money and duplication of services when they cross dotted lines. And they don't make a correlation between the cost of the service and the service. That's not their job. They just know they're paying high property taxes and they don't want to continue to pay it. In Westchester County's budget as of 2013 is $1.724 billion. Of that money was funded by $548 million in property taxes. Aggregate, every commercial, every residential property taxpayer, aggregate paid $548 million. And this is the number people say, well, we're paying too much in property taxes. This correlates to when you pay $4,000 on your $20,000 bill. That $4,000 goes into the $548 million. There are other revenue streams, sales taxes, federal state aid. You're welcome to look at this later if you'd like to get a relative idea of what goes into paying the county property tax levy. But the county levy of $548 million is the magic number that correlates to your $4,000 that you pay to county property taxes. Now, what do we do about that? How can you change that? I'm going to give you two examples. There are many more examples. Some of what Steve and Lisa will touch on will have a beneficial effect on the county as well if we talk about MTA payroll tax or other things. Let me give you a smaller one and a larger one. How'd you like to reduce this levy by $13 million? The 548 would go down to 534. How would you do that? You would do that by putting in place a cap on how much a local, well, the county government for this case, would have to pay in pension costs year over year. What was the actual year over year from 2012 to 2013? In 2012, the adopted county budget budgeted $35 million for payment of retirement system costs. That number jumps up in the 2013 budget to $50,154,000. Why? Because the state said the county government had to contribute that amount, mandated amount, for the solvency of the state pension. And there's a number for the town, and there's a number for the village of Larchmont, there's another number for the village of Mamroneck. But this county number, that's an increase of $14 million from one year to the next. A 2% property tax cap on this prior base, this number exceeds that property tax cap available. Every dime that's available in an increase of 2% is gobbled up in the pension costs. So there is a bill to cap the increase on what a county government and a local government has to pay in pension costs. If you're going to cap property tax at 2%, cap the mandated cost at 2%. Seems logical to you, seems logical to me. That's why I'm the sponsor of S2592, Tom Abenanti, A7104. It's a real bill. That bill would have made this number not go up by $14 million, but by $713,705. That is what a 2% increase, one year to the next, in what the county had to pay would amount to. The difference between these two numbers is a savings to the county government of $13 million in your property tax levy. Let me give you a different example, the one we've heard a little bit about already, and that's the big one. That's the Medicaid mandate. New York State mandates something to the tune of 25%, it's less than that, but in the tune of 25% of all costs for Medicaid have to be paid by county governments. That was a deal struck back in the 1960s. New York State has an expansive government with expansive services and programs. Its Medicaid program is the most expansive coverage of any state in the nation. But it also requires local governments, in this case the county government, to pay for some of that. That cost in the 2013 budget was $224 million paid to satisfy that one mandate. The total property levy was $548 million. So do the math. If you took this number out overnight, your county property levy would drop to $323 million, one mandate. Now, the state would have to absorb the cost, and the state could not absorb the cost in a year. So there is a bill that does that phased over a number of years. Senator Gallivan and Assemblywoman Paulin have a phase out of the Medicaid mandate bill. If that bill would have passed, this number won't drop overnight, it'll drop over a number of years. But when that number drops, if every other dime in the county government were to be static, that's a 40% decrease in property tax levy. It's a 40% decrease in your $4,000, which would be $1,600. Now, if Dave Chapnick goes home and Elaine tells him at night, honey, we're going to save 2% on our taxes, Dave's going to go, great. What's that really mean to us? But if you can save 40% on your county property taxes, now you're talking turkey. This can happen, but it requires the state of New York. Steve and I are representatives of the state of New York, but there are other representatives who disagree with these strategies because their voters have different interests. But if New York State restructures the way it does some of these mandates, then county governments would tax less, and you would see a direct savings in what you pay in property taxes.
Thank you, Senator Latimer, for those concrete examples and also some possible alternatives. Our next speaker will be Steve Otis. Steve Otis began his career in state politics as Senate Fellow and Legislative Director to State Senator Jeremy S. Weinstein from 1980 to 1985. In 1985, he joined staff. He was elected mayor of the city of Rye in 1998. I'm sorry, I missed a line. May I go back? Thank you. In 1985, he joined the staff of State Senator Susie Oppenheimer, where he served as counsel and chief of staff. Is that better? Yeah, okay. He was elected mayor of the city of Rye in 1998 and remained in that office for 12 years until 2009. He is, in fact, the longest-serving mayor in Rye's history. He is also a former president of the Westchester Municipal Officials Association, where he served on the executive committee from 2002 to 2012. Last year, he was elected to the New York State Assembly for the 91st Assembly District, which includes the Sound Shore communities of Larchmont, Mamroneck, New Rochelle, Portchester, Rybrook, and Rye. Assemblyman Otis is also a past chair of the City of Rye Conservation Commission and has served on the board of directors of the New York State Association of Conservation Commissions for 19 years. He has also served on the Westchester County Flood Action Task Force as vice chair of the Long Island Sound Watershed Intermunicipal Council, vice chair of the Westchester County Environmental Management Council, and co-chair of the City of Rye's Project Impact FEMA program. He has served on the Stewardship Committee of Audubon, New York since 2009. Assemblyman Otis is a graduate of Hobart and William Smith College and holds a master's degree in public administration from NYU and a law degree from Hofstra University School of Law. He resides in Rye with his wife, Martha. And Assemblyman Otis is going to be speaking about mandate relief for municipalities and local property tax payers.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you, Valerie and George, for your good description of some of the issues that we're all going to be talking about. You know, I'll tell you at the outset, I think about these issues with the framework of two different budgets. One is the budget that we all pay to run our own households, the property taxes we pay, what it costs to live in Westchester County, affordability, and the stresses that carries with it. And we all here know people, and even, maybe consider the equation ourselves is, how long can we afford to live in Westchester County or New York State because of property taxes? And there's really not a worse thing that I think any of us here is someone leaving because of the property tax burden, so we have to do something about that. The other budget I look at in dealing with these issues is the budget of municipal officials. And being a mayor for a long time, and Valor and I served as on the Westchester Municipal Officials Association together, you try and think, how do municipalities put together these budgets to do the things that need to be done, and yet there are other requirements and things that have to happen. Not to mention new things that you can't even dream today of how you pay for flood mitigation projects, how you pay for a new mandate that hasn't really been fully implemented, which is Federal Clean Water Act requirements having to do with stormwater. We in Westchester County on the Sound Shore have already paid an increase in our county sewer tax for Federal Clean Water Act requirements for the sewage treatment plants, and because of work of a number of us up here, that amount is actually $200 million more or less than it could have been because of working with Westchester County and trying to find a less expensive way to do that. So there are a lot of requirements, and what I would say is, sort of following up on what George was saying, what are the things that we can do to try and change the equation and make New York State more livable and survivable in terms of these tax burdens? So there are mandates, there are little mandates, and there are big mandates. And a lot of the little mandates are, some of the little mandates, as Valerie mentioned, have been taken up in small ways, whether they're for school districts or for municipalities in the last few years. Every year there are a few things they chip away. They've done some things to make it easier for municipalities to do bidding and contracting together, or to piggyback on federal contracts or state contracts. And it's sort of good, but is it going to make a difference in terms of affordability in Westchester County? Not individually, and probably not even in a combined way. So you have to go after big ticket items, and they're not all related to mandates per se. It's sort of a cost allocation is another way of framing it. Why do we have such high property taxes in New York State? New York State is structured in a way where more services are assigned to the property tax than other states around the country. So George talked about Medicaid. We're the only state in the country that charges a big chunk of Medicaid to counties and to the property tax. No one else does this. And so the effort to get Medicaid taken off of the property tax is actually not a new one. Hugh Carey, when he was governor in the late 70s and early 80s, proposed the state take over Medicaid for the very reason that it's such a big chunk, probably the biggest chunk of our property tax, and he was rebuffed by the legislature at that time. Medicaid growth, George correctly pointed out, $7 billion. Actually, in next year, it's going to grow to $7.5 billion of property tax charges just on that Medicaid charge. So it's really something that has to be changed. Now, New York State has cut taxes in the last few years, and New York State has paid for new things, increased school aid this year. And so how did New York State cut taxes and increase expenses? Well, some of the savings from consolidation of state agencies, which has been going on, some of the savings for other kinds of efficiencies in state government allowed for an increase in school aid. And so we need to find the pressure point to get some of this Medicaid, the bill that Amy Paulin has in, phases in the state takeover Medicaid over 20 years. I can't wait that long. I think that even $1 billion a year in 7 or 8 years would be a big assist. Pension costs. the way pension costs work, it's sort of interesting, and this is one where it's sort of a mandate, maybe not a mandate. It's certainly you have to pay it, but the state actually pays for pension costs in the same way municipalities or the county does or school districts do. Medicaid rates are based upon the stock market. When the stock market goes up, pension costs go down, and when the stock market goes down, pension costs go up. So we actually don't even pay the highest rate of pension costs in the recent history. Since 1972, the actual highest rate point for municipal pensions was in 1972. And the highest rate for police and fire pension was not today, but it was in 1979. It goes down. Actually, the pension rate is actually going to go down a tiny bit next year because the stock market improved. But Valerie gave the statistics from Mamroneck. I'll tell you the statistics from Rye, and this is sort of, you know, if you're trying to set up a municipal budget. In 1999, the city of Rye paid to the pension system a total for all of their employees, $9,000. Tiny. The next year, it went up to like $250,000, then it went up to $500,000, then the next year we had to budget for $1.5 million, just in the span of 3 or 4 years, and they remain pretty high today. They may creep down, but this is a tremendous burden. So because the state sets the rules, the concept in George's bill, which is that we cap the local share to a certain amount, and then have the state pick up the rest, is a way of taking back some of these control of the property tax, because there's been a shift over the last 30 years. More costs on the property tax, less costs handled by other sources of revenue. Now, there are, and Valerie mentioned a few, but NICOM, New York State Conference of Mayors, and the New York State Association of Towns, they have checklists of mandate relief things that they advocate for. And Valerie mentioned a good deal of them. Some of them relate to labor relations, and Valerie mentioned some. There are others related to the rules having to do with binding arbitration, the rules related to employees that are out on disability and how they're paid. And so municipalities are very concerned about these. But as George alluded to, there are two sides to each of these arguments. And when it comes to things that involve labor relations, it's rare, very rare that you're going to see a unilateral change in a labor relation provision without some give and take. And so there probably needs to be some discussion points on some of these provisions, how the tailored law works, how all those things cost out. But they're not going to happen in isolation where the municipalities, school districts, the state basically just changes things and doesn't have to have deal with some issues that the public sector labor folks are concerned about. The last thing that I'd like to talk about is STAR, because STAR was a major form of mandate relief. Started in the 90s, and Westchester County was the biggest recipient of STAR. STAR is a tax, originally a tax exemption, and then there was also a rebate part of STAR that came in for a few years. STAR peaked in 2007, 2008 at $4.6 billion of tax relief statewide, and a lot of that went to Westchester County. After the recession in 2008, they eliminated what was called the middle class STAR, the STAR rebate program, so we're left now at about $3.6 billion. But we're down from where we could have been, we're down from where we should be. That's a piece of the equation in terms of mandate relief for the people that pay taxes. And so if I were to prioritize what I think we need to go after in Albany and what you should lobby for, it should be the Medicaid takeover. It should be capping pension costs, so that's not progressively an increase on the property taxes. And it should be reinvesting in STAR. STAR went down for a few years during the recession. It's started to now creep up the last couple of years. But those are the biggest ticket items that we would feel in our personal budgets. The smaller stuff, I wonder whether or not you change some of these little collective bargaining rules. and I was a mayor for 12 years, but I'm not so sure that those savings really trickle down. And one thing that I would say related to Medicaid, a provision of the law should be, if the state takes over either of these things, the Medicaid piece or the pension piece, it should be required that those governments have to lower their tax levy for the amount that was picked up by the state, because there's no sense the state finding the money someplace else and not seeing it reflected in property tax cuts for people. So I'll have more chance to talk during the question and answer, and I'm also interested in Lisa's education issues as well. But we need to go after the big pieces so that we can feel the difference, and that will help municipalities and that will help school districts as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you also for providing some concrete alternatives. Our next speaker is probably less familiar to those of you in the audience, but the subject she's going to be talking about is one of the most critical, and that's education mandates. Lisa Davis has been the executive director of the Westchester Putnam School Boards Association since July 2008. During this time, Ms. Davis has worked to expand the depth and breadth of the Westchester Putnam School Boards Association's programming and outreach, and has increased the association's visibility and standing in the region. She is a co-coordinator for the New York Education Policy Fellowship Program, and she has served on the Chappaqua Board of Education for 9 years, from 1998 to 2007, including 2 years as board president. She was the Westchester Putnam School Boards Association president from 2005 to 2007. In addition to the WPSBA board, she has served on the School Board Advisory Council to the Commissioner of Education, the School Board Advisory Council to the Chancellor of Education, New York State School Board Association Task Force on School District Pension Alternatives in 2006, and was a NYSBA legislative representative. Excuse me. Her involvement with public education began with the Chappaqua PTA, where she chaired innumerable committees and was a school PTA chair and Chappaqua PTA president. Ms. Davis is a graduate of Barnard College and was awarded an MBA from NYU Stern School of Business. Lisa Davis.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's this topic is so important, and you've heard so much already. So let me move my microphone closer, and let me just run right into the part around education, because that's certainly what's very near and dear to my heart. I want to start by saying that mandates are not necessarily a bad word, and I think that sometimes they do get a bad rap, and I'm probably with many of my colleagues, the biggest offenders of that. Because if you think about it, a lot of the things that are put forward are well-intentioned. It's for something very often that we would think would be common sense that we might want to do. The issue that we really take is how it's implemented and where the funding comes from, or should I say where it doesn't come from. And the fact that things are being pushed down at the local level. And as was said previously, New York does a great job with that. So, for example, when we see, if you look through legislation, and if you go through and see some legislation that's pending, there'll be a line that will say fiscal impact. And almost invariably, the fiscal impact will say none. And that's because there really isn't going to be any fiscal impact on New York State. The fiscal impact is going to be on the local municipality, on the school district, or whatever the affected entities are. So that's really the place that we really feel needs a strong focus, is any legislation that goes through really needs to have a strong analysis that was mentioned previously of what the fiscal impact is, and there has to be input from the local entities. If it's just coming out of Albany, that's not really necessarily going to tell the tale of what the impact's going to look like for local municipalities. So I just really want to start with that, because I think that's really a baseline premise as we go forward. There are so many mandates on school districts. The list goes on. And if you've ever gone to a school board meeting during budget time, I think what you'll probably notice is that they will spend hours and hours on maybe $10,000 or $20,000 or even a $5,000 item. And part of that is because so much of what's in the budget is either mandated, required by the state, or by contractual obligation, so that you really end up nitpicking over some small things, or you end up talking about staffing cuts more recently in order to balance your budget. So think about that as we come into that season in the spring. A couple of the big items were mentioned, and I'll just go through some of them because I want to give you a flavor from Mamroneck about how that actually affects you in your school district. So a Triborough amendment was mentioned previously, and a great description, so thank you. You saved me on that, on having to explain that one. Obviously, from school districts, some of the other pieces that concern us that don't concern some other entities are tenure. New York State has a 3-year tenure, shorter than a lot of other states has. And we actually, one of the things that we promote is a 5-year renewable tenure. And we could talk further about that later if that's of interest to people. Doesn't necessarily have the, well, it kind of actually could indirectly have a fiscal impact, but a little less so. And of course, the other thing is, in terms of, as we're in the time now where we're doing some layoffs, is LIFO, last in, first out, which basically says that if you are doing any layoffs, it can only be based on seniority. There's no other factor that can play in. That's a real issue in school districts when we're at the stage where we are now. Another piece I want to mention that hasn't been brought up, pensions were certainly mentioned, and that's a very key part. But there's also some legislation related to pensions that was put forward around the year 2000. And that said that people who are in what's called Tier 2, 3, and 4, there are different tiers, and it's based on when you were hired and what was in place at the time. So employees that are in the Tier 3 and 4 had been paying 3% toward their pension for the entire time that they were serving or in employment. And even 3%, if you think about it, for most of you, is actually pretty low from the employee standpoint. At that time, it was changed to say that after 10 years of employment, you wouldn't have to put anything in. So basically what that did was it shifted that cost from the employee to the employer. We would maintain that that's the kind of thing that really should be locally negotiated, any change like that, which has to do with an additional cost to the employer. But it's a state pension item, so it was put forward through Albany. If you look at Mamroneck, that cost alone for that additional 3% for anybody in Tier 3 and 4 currently, who's over 10 years, and that would be most of them at this point, is $1.4 million a year. So think about that $1.4 million, that's pretty significant. Figure out how many teachers that would be, or some of the other things that could equate to. The other thing related to pension is there was some pension reform recently. There's a new tier. We've been very strong proponents of that it should be either a hybrid program. It shouldn't just be a defined benefit program. It should either be something where there's an option where you could have a defined benefit or defined contribution. The pension system that we have in New York State is really geared to people who enter and stay basically for life. But if anybody who has kids in their 20s or 30s know that they sometimes tend to flit a little bit. If you're in this system and you're not there for the long term, you can't transport it if you leave the public world. So we think that there are other options, and actually SUNY and CUNY offer those hybrid systems and have done so for many years, probably under the premise that professors do move around. In terms of special education, New York, kind of similar to Medicaid, there's about 200 regulations that supersede what the federal IDA regulations would be. I'll give you an example of one. We have to transport children 50 miles for special education programs. If you think about where Mamroneck is, you're talking about into New York City, into Connecticut. Savings there, if it were reduced to the 15-mile radius that it is for other private and parochial schools, would save Mamroneck about $325,000. A lot of the other changes that we've talked about around special education don't necessarily affect the child in the classroom and their learning, but so many of them are around either administrative or, quite frankly, litigation kind of items, and there's definitely savings that could be had where we would still deliver appropriate services to children. The WICS law was mentioned before. You had a recent bond project. estimating that usually there's an estimate said that it would be about 10 to 20% savings. On that $22 million bond, Mamroneck would have saved between $1.6 and $3.2 million for the expenses that you had to put out. I'm also going to talk a little bit, I want to go through revenue first on Race to the Top, which is the biggest unfunded mandate you've seen in a long time. But I want to just take a few moments to go from the expenditure side to the fiscal constraints on the revenue side. Tax levy limit. Everyone calls it a 2% cap. Tax cap, it's not. It's not 2% and it's not a tax cap. What it really talks to is the tax levy limit. And the tax levy is the amount of money that the school district says we're going to need to operate. And school districts, there are two pieces to it. It's always complicated, right? But one of them has to do with the CPI. So this year going forward for municipalities, it was 1.66% because they do their budget sooner. We'll get the number in December. We think it could be even lower than 1.66% as a base number. We won't know until it gets there. The other thing is in New York State, school districts need a 60% override by the voters in order to go over the levy limit. Municipalities have a 60%, but it's by the governing body. We've questioned that one from the beginning. The other thing I want to mention is that it really does, it's really unsustainable. It puts a limit on what school districts can raise, and you should be able to raise those funds on your own. One other thing related to revenue is the gap elimination adjustment. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it was mentioned before that New York State cut taxes. So New York State cut its taxes, but it's not paying the full amount that it should to school districts for school aid. And the difference between what New York State says that you should be getting, so there's ones that go out and it says, here's what you should get for your aid. And then there's something called gap elimination adjustment, which is basically a percentage that's taken off in order for New York State to balance its budget. So for Mamroneck, the gap elimination adjustment this past year was $1.8 million, which equated to almost 1% of your tax levy. And if I look at it for all of our districts, I have it here, it's $306 million over the last 4 years. Big money. The other thing I want to touch on is Race to the Top. Race to the Top was money that New York State won, and I put that in quotes, from, I'm sure everybody knows about it. It was $700 million. It is barely, and I mean barely, a down payment on the cost that it is entailing to be able to put this into place. It involves so many different pieces. APPR, which is the Annual Professional Performance Review, which is for teachers. That alone in Mamroneck is costing you about $250,000 a year. Common Core Learning Standards, which are kind of new, you've probably heard about them, hopefully. And that's starting to go into place, those learning standards. It requires a lot of work in terms of professional development, resources, testing assessments. For Mamroneck, that's going to cost about $450,000 annually to implement. And then the last piece, which has not come in yet, is something called PARC assessments, and those are the tests, and they're going to ultimately be done online. Mamroneck estimates it'll be between $300,000 and $400,000 to implement those. So that'll give you a sense of the impact. This is just within your own district. We have 54 school districts. You can do the math and take a look at that. The other thing that I did want to mention is, which is part of that and isn't necessarily a mandate that has dollars attached to it, but it has to do with student data privacy. And that's also part of under the Race to the Top. There's lots of information that has to be reported to New York State. It goes through a company called InBloom. There's a lot of concern about the amount of data that's being gathered, the type of data, things like student discipline records, some personal information which has never before been sent up and certainly never attached to a name before. We're very concerned about that. That's also part of this mandate. Our basic premise is that if you can't protect it, don't collect it. And there is some legislation being promoted on that, and some of it is from our local, it's passed in the Assembly, and we're hoping that we will see it go through in the Senate. In terms of, I'm going to really lay out one thing, and that's for the solution, and that is grassroots advocacy. Because when it comes to the school district items, we need everybody out there who is a voter and who pays taxes to go out and talk about the impact that these losses are having on your schools. This is not what anybody signed up for when they moved to a town like Mamroneck, or really to any community. And we're watching our schools. You will watch them little by little. It's a continuum of things that are going to be taken away in order to stay under that levy cap, and in order to pay for some of these other things that have come down the pike. So the biggest way that you can address this is you need to speak out. You need to be educated. Being at a forum like this is an excellent first start, but it's really important that there's grassroots coalitions forming to say this is just not what we signed up for. Let's stop the action and let's see what we can do differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis, for clarifying a lot of points, particularly the tax cap and the tax levy. I think that is one of the most confusing things for all of us. Our last speaker, as was mentioned earlier, came this evening from Albany, and we thank her for doing so. She is well known, though, throughout the state. Barbara Bartoletti has been a member of the League of Women Voters since 1978, and the legislative director for the League of Women Voters of New York State since 1988. She oversees all legislation of interest to the League in the state legislature. She lectures statewide on advocacy issues and topics such as informed and active participation in government. In addition, she offers political commentary for local television outlets in the Capital District. Ms. Bartoletti advocates on good government issues as well as other league issues to statewide editorial boards. She is a member of Governor Andrew Cuomo's Mandate Relief Redesign Team. Ms. Bartoletti has worked extensively also in Central Asia, where she has presented at conferences and led workshop training in advocacy, media relations, and coalition building. In Russia also, and Armenia. She also gives numerous workshops for not-for-profit advocacy organizations to help them impact state government. Ms. Bartoletti is a member of the Regents Advisory Commission for Accreditation of Proprietary Colleges and sat on the Federal Election Assistance Commission in Washington, D.C. In July 2013, she was appointed by Governor Andrew Cuomo to the Moreland Commission to investigate public corruption. Ms. Bartoletti.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. One of the things I most enjoy about being legislative director for the League of Women Voters over these, now we're going on over three decades, is that I get to come out and talk to people all over the state about issues that they care about, and mostly about issues that certainly the League and the public care about. This certainly falls into that category, although I must tell you up front, the League does not have a position per se on mandate relief. As many of you sitting in the audience tonight know, as you are League members, the League has a whole process that we go through before we can take a position on an issue. We study it to death, and we become extremely well informed on it. And then we form a consensus. From that, a position evolves, and then it becomes my job to take that position and then impact my colleagues here on the dais with the Senate and the Assembly. So I spend most of my time, when they're not in session, it's out doing this type of thing, but certainly from January to the end of June, I spend all of my time roaming the halls of Albany, trying to get legislators, senators, and assembly people to do whatever it takes. Sometimes it takes shaming them, particularly on good government issues, but often it takes just getting what Lisa, I think, did a very good job of beginning our discussion on grassroots advocacy. And that's something I'm hoping that perhaps I can initiate in you, get you charged up enough over an issue like mandate relief, which does impact your very budgets, your own household budget, so that you can become grassroots lobbyists on this issue and impact. It doesn't appear as if you really have to do too much impacting on your state senator, your state assembly member, since I think they understand this issue extraordinarily well, and I would believe from that that they would be your best advocates in Albany. But there are so many different ways other than traveling up the Taconic or up the thruway to Albany to actually go and visit them. As you know, they're in Albany starting in January about 2 days a week, and then eventually it becomes 2.5, 3 days a week. Around budget time, it actually goes to 4, maybe sometimes 5 days a week, and then at the end of session, we go back to being that full week. But other than that, legislators are here in their local districts, and that's what we have always said as the League is the very best time to go visit your local legislators. In Albany on Lobby Day, which is on Tuesdays, in between committee meetings, which also happen, and now because we have a kind of a crazy rule that says you have to be in your seat to vote, so we now have session days on Tuesdays. So on Tuesdays, it's an extremely chaotic, very busy day. When they come home, they are here in their district, and that is by far, no matter who your legislator is, and I assume most of you are represented by the two men sitting here with me tonight, but that is by far the best time to see them in their offices. Make an appointment on a Wednesday afternoon, Thursday or Friday, and you will have probably their undivided attention, they and their staff, for a certain amount of time. In Albany, you might catch them on the fly, or you might get them for 10 or 15 minutes in between meetings. So my advice always is, don't go to Albany, get them when they're home, because that's when you can really get them to be responsive and when you can get them to be accountable, which are the two things I think as League members we talk about. We involve ourselves by voters, not from campaigns, but by voters in the electoral process. And then once you have an elected representative, the next thing you do is you keep them responsive and you keep them accountable. That's how a democratic representative democracy actually works. But considering that you have two advocates on your side right here in Westchester, what other things might you as an individual be able to do? And people say, well, I'm just one person. What difference can I make? How can I change, which seems to be, no matter what the issue is, seems to be such an awful way to do things? Well, if everybody felt that way, nothing would ever change in this country. And I think we have a League person sitting right here in the second row, Elizabeth Radow, who felt that way about fracking, and she can tell you what an amazing difference one person can make on an issue. And I'm going to tell you some of the ways, tried and true ways she has used, and the tried and true ways that as grassroots advocates you can also do. Number one, you become informed. And you've taken that first real leap right here tonight. You have looked at this issue and you've decided that this is something you care about, and so you have listened to the speakers up here tonight and you have become well informed. That's probably the hardest job you do. You now, hopefully, will be at least somewhat, depending on how you feel about this, well informed on the issue. If not, you already have met some people where you can become better informed. And that's really what you have to do. Be informed, know your arguments, and then you decide on a way of taking those arguments and making other people decide that they think you're on the right track and they want to join you. And that's how you create momentum. That's how you create a movement. That's how you get your neighbors involved. You don't just have to, and I shouldn't say that right after Election Day, just have to run for election. It's a very hard job to run for election. I do understand that. And I think we have a newly elected official tonight, and she will tell you it's an exhausting job. So, but as a non-elected citizen of your community, there are a number of things you can do. One, you've gotten well informed. Then two, you have decided that what is possible in my community to make my voice heard? How do I do that? Well, you probably, I would think in a community like this, you have a weekly newspaper, most likely, that gets published every week, yes? Yes. Well, I don't know about anybody else, but I spend about 70% of my time with the Albany Press Corps, what's called the Albany Press Corps, the LCA. And I have established a relationship with those press people. So when I come to them and talk to them about an issue, they pretty much listen. That's what you need to do in your local community. If it takes, take your weekly editor, or your editor, you probably have some amount of an editorial board, at least someone who is responsible for writing editorials. Make an appointment and go see them. Invite them to have coffee. Invite them to maybe come to, and many of you I think are league members, invite them. The first thing we tell leagues, invite them to come to our meetings. Invite them to learn about the issue. They deal with a lot of issues. They want you as a resource. They want to become well informed on the issue you care about. And then they take that issue and they write about it and they get it into the paper. You might get an editorial, or even more than an editorial. Editorials are good, but you want to get articles. You want to educate your community the way you have been educated tonight. So you become their resource. You get to know the reporters. That takes a little bit of time, establishing a relationship, but they're your neighbors most likely. Get to know them, get them to write about this issue you care about with using the arguments you have become well informed. That's probably your first line. Then certainly there are perhaps coalitions in your community that you can join with, whether it's your school boards, whether it's your PTA. How many of you here belong to a PTA? I think maybe some of us have gotten beyond our kids in school, but our neighbors perhaps have children in the school district where what we've heard tonight is a huge issue for them and for you as grandparents or as citizens who want the next generation to be extremely well educated as your children were. So pay attention to what your school board does. Go to your school board meeting. Make your voices heard there. We have a very aggressive association of counties in Albany. You might want to call and get someone from the Association of Counties to come and speak to a group. What you want to do is you want to create a buzz. So you have everybody in your community talking about it. Then, because you already have your two legislators on your side, you have to know how government works. And that's probably the hardest thing to swallow, is how our government works. The League, as you know, is a strong, good government organization. I spend, because I have very good people like Elizabeth and other specialists, the League has about 20 specialists on all different areas. So I don't have to become an expert on any single issue, but I have to be kind of knowledgeable about all of them. But most of my time is spent trying to make this government work well and responsibly. So I actually always advocate that you want to keep your government very, very accountable. And in order to keep it accountable, you have to know how it works. Now, this is how it works. You elect, and we have, as many of you who've been around the League know, we have some of the most lax campaign finance laws in this entire country. And that is where an awful lot of my energies and your energies are going to have to go, because before you can change any of this mandate relief, do any of the things that all of these people have talked about, you're going to have to make sure that the special interests are fighting you at every single turn. And so what I would encourage you to do is learn about campaign finance laws, make sure your elected officials know that we have to change the campaign finance laws, because until we do, the special interest voice in Albany is so much louder than yours. So you must join together. You've already been well informed. Join together, deal with your press, and work together to help us change the campaign finance laws so that your voice can certainly be heard, whether it's here in your county government or, most importantly on this issue, at your state level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the speakers, especially for being so respectful of the time and for providing us with so much information. Before we go on to the question and answer period, which has been provided for in this program, I believe that Nina Recchio-Cuddy is going to tell us a few things about how the League and the Summit work and how you can participate.
Good evening. Upon entering, we did distribute these forms, and these little forms are, we'd ask you to fill them out, and you can leave them on the stage. If you don't have one, Carolyn and Lynette are distributing them. It's so that we can keep you apprised of further events. There will be an upcoming event on identity theft, and the League of Women Voters has its Friday breakfast, I think, still at the Nautilus.
Actually, it's going to be on December 5th. We're going to have meet the newly elected officials at the Village of Mamroneck Library at 7:15. That's a Thursday, December 5th. So instead of our
PM.
In addition, there's a space here to fill out. If you are interested, the league, the local league is trying to organize a study so that they can follow the process to be able to lobby on issues of mandate reform. So mark it if you're interested. We hope you are, and then you can leave the forms on the stage. In addition, there's going to be a question and answer period. We hope you do have questions. There's one mic here. The only caveat is just come up one at a time and ask your questions. We will take as many questions as we can, but we do have to leave at 9:30. So I thank you for coming, and at this time, I'd like to turn it over to the audience.
This question is directed to the two legislators. You mentioned that there's $7.5 billion of Medicaid costs that the state is imposing on the counties, as opposed to the other 49 states that pick that up at the state level, and that pursuant to legislation, this could be eliminated either overnight, over 7 years, over 20 years, whatever period of time. Let's say it's eliminated overnight. Where's that $7.5 billion going to come from? Isn't the state just going to raise our state income taxes by the same amount? So instead of paying it to the county, we're just going to pay it to the state?
Okay, I'll go first. Well, the first thing is that the state sets the rules for what Medicaid coverage is and does. And if the state has to pay for the full boat of it, then the state may redefine what is covered under Medicaid. You have states that cover things and not cover other things. And as long as, I'll give you the example, if I go out and buy a new car and I can get you to pay for a quarter of it, I'm probably going to buy a nicer car. If I find that I'm going to have to pay the full amount, then I'll probably get a lesser car. And if we're going to look at right-sizing the costs of Medicaid, then that will probably be happening when the state has the full financial burdens of it. If there is a question about the financing of it at the state level and it's phased in over time, then it's going to be phased in with additional revenues that are generated by the state. But when the state taxes, it doesn't tax your property. It taxes your income. It taxes your business. Now, some people find that any tax is objectionable to them, but the regressive tax is the property tax, because that is a tax that you pay without necessarily having the capacity to pay for it. It's based on the value of a house, and your next-door neighbor may have a completely different income structure, but you pay the same amount of taxes if your houses are the same. With income tax, with business tax, you pay based on the relative resources that you have, which may grow over years or not. So it's not simply just coming out of one pocket or the other. It puts the responsibility to make the cost control decisions at the level that the taxation is coming, and the taxation is a more progressive taxation at that level.
it's an ongoing process in terms of trying to control those costs. But as I alluded in my statement also relating to the Medicaid thing, there are other savings that have occurred in state government over the last few years that have saved the state and saved taxpayers money, and some of that has gone into other places in state government in terms of efficiency or new costs. We've had some new costs as related to flood control around the state and emergency management. So money does get moved around that's created by savings in other places. So one of the opportunities is, as we have savings in Medicaid and other places in state government, a good place to look to invest that money is reducing property taxes for the reasons that George alluded to. Property tax is the worst tax because if you are, especially if you are retired, you're still paying. The income tax you pay based upon what you're earning in a given year. So it's a very regressive tax, but there are other places to draw savings and try and draw down the property tax through Medicaid relief or increased investment in STAR.
Could I comment on that? Could I comment? Under Obamacare, I think that the federal government is supposed to cover the increased cost of Medicaid for 2 years. Now, presumably, there are going to be more and more people signing up for Medicaid. That's what it seems like it's going to be, which means that after 2 years, there'll be more and more people on Medicaid, which if we leave it the way it is, the burden on the property owner we can't define now, but should presumably increase substantially. So I think that a piece of legislation that says, well, we'll phase it out over a 20-year period when we can rationally predict that 3 years from now, there'll be a spike in the number and therefore the cost of Medicaid. The 20 years is too long, in my opinion. The other thing is, what about New York City? I mean, I just want to get back to what Ms. Bartoletti is talking about. We can get ourselves very well organized. And George alluded to it. It says, well, you have special interests, too. I mean, we don't like these mandates, but maybe the people who are in the legislature in the city of New York think these mandates are just fine, because it's not directly affecting their constituents as much as it would be affecting our constituents here in a relatively well-off suburban environment. Do you know what I mean? If most of your constituents are living in houses that pay much less tax, or they're living in apartment houses or whatever it is, I don't think they're so worried about this. The Congress, is that true? The senators and assemblymen?
I'll just jump in without extending this beyond too much. There's no question that if you own a home in the city of New York, you pay a lot less in property taxes. The commercial base of real estate in New York City is a significantly higher percentage of the generation of money than out of the property tax than it is in suburbia, where it's still single-family homeowners that are the base of the property tax. So they don't feel the property tax problems. If you have a friend who has a house in the Bronx or Staten Island and you ask them how much you pay in property taxes, it's minimal compared to ours. So yes, our colleagues who don't represent the suburbs or upstate don't have the same pressure on them. They don't have forums to do these kinds of things. They have other problems, but not this problem.
Yeah, and what usually happens is because, again, in New York City, you have a huge number of people who rent. So you have renters, they don't pay property tax. But over the period of time I've been in the legislature, what seems to happen often is if you have a real battle over property tax, you can be sure that they're linking that to rent control. So you have, because rent control matters to the people in New York City, property tax matters to the people upstate and in the suburbs around New York City. So they usually, for years, that was always linked. So the upstaters got something and New York City got something. That's the way it often works in the legislature. And I must tell you, too, when you introduced me, I did sit on the governor's mandate relief initial task force. I sat there not because the League has such a position on mandate relief, which we don't. I sat there as a open government advocate. The League often provides what legislators think is the seal of approval, the golden seal of approval. So they think if I sit on a mandate or any kind of a task force, well, I'm going to be able to provide that. What they fail to often remind themselves is that if I sit there, one, it's got to be open, two, the public has to be able to video cam it and watch it, and so I actually sit there representing the public so that things are not done in the dead of night.
Can I just add one little loose end on the Medicaid costs? There's actually a Medicaid cap that was set up 3 years ago, and accelerated this year in the budget. So our Medicaid costs actually will not go up unless that cap gets repealed or whatever. The Medicaid cap was supposed to be phased in over 3 years, and then this year it was agreed that it's phased in, I think, 13-14 fiscal year. The county Medicaid costs statewide will not go up again unless that cap is repealed. So there is a protection against that piece of it. Also, New York City, they don't feel it in their property tax, but they feel it they have an income tax in New York City. And so that is how they pay their portion of Medicaid costs.
But they have a much bigger tax base.
Thank you. I'm glad you're jumping in on these things because there are so many different aspects to all of these questions. The next question, please.
My name is Michael Ray, and I'm a resident of the village of Larchmont. And the question that I have is for the two legislators, Senator Latimer and Assemblyman Otis. A lot of your presentation was devoted to describing mandates from Albany. What I didn't hear a lot of is legislation that individually the two of you are sponsoring. There's a lot of things I could say that you should be sponsoring, but it seems like there's, for example, in the pension context, two no-brainers. Why are we allowing pension spiking, and why aren't we talking about reinstating pension contributions for 3 and 4? They would certainly have a large impact, and I'd just like an explanation as to why the two of you are not sponsoring legislation like this or similar legislation.
Sure. In terms of the legislation that we discussed earlier, George is the prime sponsor on the bill on the pension cap, and I am a co-sponsor of that bill in the Assembly, and I'm a co-sponsor of the bill on the takeover of Medicaid costs in the Assembly as well. In terms of pension spiking and other things in pensions, we've actually changed that with two changes in law in 2009 and 2012. There are two new tiers, Tier 5 and Tier 6. So those kinds of things are much more restricted in the new tiers. You cannot go back to old tiers and change the rules retroactively, because there is a provision in the state constitution that says that essentially your pension arrangement cannot be diminished while you are an employee. So the reason new tiers are created is to create more restrictive rules for new employees, but courts have held that you can't go back and change things after the fact. So what you're asking for on the spiking has been addressed in Tier 6,
Excuse me, the audience can't hear your comments.
Phil Donahue has to come back and give you the mic. So.
First of all, you could amend the Constitution, the state Constitution, and second of all, those new tiers affect so few people. Most of the people, I believe, are in Tier 3 and 4, so the relief is too little, and it comes too late, really, to help the town out.
You can't change. If you repealed the provision in the state constitution, which could happen, that would only mean that you could retroactively change arrangements for employees in the future. The people that have had the protection that they have in that constitutional provision, you cannot undo that provision. So you cannot undo that provision as it relates to current employees. So,
Unless you go bankrupt like Detroit.
Yeah, let me get a whack in on this, if you don't mind. We were given an 8-minute time limit, and in my 8-minute time limit, I gave you 2 very specific examples, and I stayed within the time limit. I'd be happy if you want to reach out to me, anybody in the room. I'll give you a list of 15 bills that I'm on that are all mandate relief bills. Lisa spoke about some of the issues they're dealing with, the APPR and the mandatory testing issues. Those are legislation that I've supported publicly, both in votes in the legislature and bills I've sponsored, co-sponsored in most of these cases. Some of these issues are dealt with in the budget. Most people don't realize that when New York State does its budget, we enact a budget that's not just a numerical document, but it has the force of law. And many of the changes that we've advocated for were things that we advocated for in amendments to the budget, many of which didn't happen, but they represent an advocacy position. So I wouldn't judge my position or Steve's position on the basis of an 8-minute presentation. You're certainly welcome to spend some time with us, and we'll be happy to give you all the details that would give you a greater sense of comfort.
May I just make one other comment on the pension? Because I'm the one who brought up the 3%. And the way that it reads is that you may not reduce, diminish, or something, the benefit. And so the question becomes, is the way that you contribute to the plan the benefit, or is that the contribution method? And while I agree that, chances are something like that would end up in the courts, there's a bit of a gray as to what actually does constitute a benefit.
Thank you. Before we go to the next question, just one moment, please. Can the members of the audience hear the questions that are being asked? All right. If at any time you cannot hear, would you please put up your hand so that to alert us to the fact that we either have to do something about the mic or have people speak up a little bit more? Thank you. Please go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Carol Aiken, and I live in the town of Mamroneck. And I'm deeply appreciative of the learning more about the mandates and about the possibilities of lowering mandates. But I think if the school districts are comprising 60% of our property taxes, and I know this was just touched on, but wouldn't the main focus be important to be on saying, let's look at how to do this and what's the most fair way to do this? And if you do have people being priced out of the community, which is happening all the time, not just retired people, possibly look at doing it from not the town tax, but the school tax, taxing on the basis of income. Because I know that's a hard sell, but it seems to me this is the only answer for lowering property taxes and having a fair distribution for those of us who have had kids in the schools, who don't have kids in the schools, and, retired people. Suddenly there's this equalization. If you have 2 identical homes and the properties are being taxed at the same rate, and one is, say, retired and the other, and a fixed income, and the other has a $150,000, executive job, that doesn't seem fair. So there just needs to be that equal.
Ms. Davis, would you like to jump in on that, or would?
I'll jump in on one part of it, and it's more of a legislative question about how you actually raise, and there have been some pieces of legislation that have been promoted, circuit breaker and some hybrid methods of not only having it rely on property tax. I do want to, though, share one piece that fits into it, because in this area, we really are, from an income tax standpoint, we are the engine that drives the whole train and the whole state. So, for example, if you look at income tax, on average, and these numbers are a couple of years old, but for every $1 in income tax that this region, Westchester and Putnam, sends up to Albany, for school, for revenue back in state aid for school districts, we get about 12 cents back on the dollar. Statewide, for every $1 that's sent in an income tax, statewide, the return is about 77 cents. So I think you have to, really look at from an income tax standpoint, similarly, to, property tax, most of that is coming from this area, most of that's coming from this area right now. So you have a lot of the districts that are in the rural upstate, which have very low property taxes, and there's very low wealth in some of those areas. There's also low wealth in a lot of our communities, as you well know. But in those areas, the bulk of their schools are being financed by state aid. And sometimes when we talk to our colleagues statewide, they forget that actually the money doesn't just show up in Albany, that it actually comes from here. And then if you think about it, then on top of that, you're also then spending the bulk of your money on property taxes for your own district. I think in Mamaroneck, you probably get maybe, if you take out building aid, maybe 4%, I'm going to guess, something in that realm, for state aid for education back. It's a very small percentage, probably, I think I looked, it was about 88% that actually the local property tax is paying to support your schools.
And I think probably what both of your legislators could tell you is that the education part of the state budget is the biggest battle that goes on every budget's time in Albany. Now, the League does have a position on the circuit breaker. We do support the circuit breaker. We tried desperately to get the second floor, governor's office, and the legislature to adopt that. And
Could you just explain what the circuit breaker is?
well, it's essentially what the audience member described. It's instead of doing it from a tax cap perspective, you rely on, and maybe Steve can probably even elaborate on this, but you rely on an income tax. It's more of a progressive taxation.
It capped how much you would pay based upon your income.
That's right.
And the middle class star was actually had an income-based component to it also, but that was eliminated. Are you going to talk in this one?
Yeah,
Richard?
I am.
Can I say one thing first?
Go ahead.
You made a very good point about the fact that, Lisa made a very good point about the fact that basically in Westchester, a lot of our districts, 95% of our school budgets are paid for on the property tax. This is one of the real problems, and it's sort of a property wealth formula that dictates it that way. A number of years ago, when I was working for Susie, we looked at legislation to allow school districts the option of raising a portion of their revenues through income tax only coming from that community. And it was so complicated because of the timing of when people pay income tax and when school budgets pass that it was going to be very difficult to work logistically. We met with the tax department. I will tell you, I came to the conclusion that if you're looking for a more efficient way to deliver property tax relief to people, the STAR program actually did it more efficiently than creating some new income tax thing that was a little more complicated, and I think that's still my position.
I just want to say one other thing, too, in a very general context brought up by this conversation. Education is not, in my judgment, a user fee-based service. There's a reality that all of us have. I have it now, where I do not have a child in the education system where I live. I did for 18 years when she went from kindergarten, well, for 12 years, from kindergarten to 12. I don't use the police department every day. If I had to pay just for the time that the police department once came to my house in the last 20 years, and then I was going to pay a 1/20th share of whatever the number of other people that had a police call that year, I'd have a phenomenal cost. We've reached a point, because we are under a high property tax situation, where we're looking at the services that we have, and we're trying to say, I don't use that service, therefore my taxes are killing me, I don't want that service. On that basis, how many of you have ever taken a public bus in Westchester County in the last month? Do we think we need to eliminate the public bus system? Of course we can't. We can't do that. It's not right. We need that as part of service to people who need it, and it's part of an economic engine. So what I would caution us to do, when we look for how are we going to go about reducing property taxes, let's not just look at something because we don't use the service and assume that it's not a necessary service. Let's deal with what, in my judgment, is the reason for the tax problem that we have now. We have a structural problem in this state where uniquely this state pushes costs down to the local level. That makes us different from Vermont if you have a house in Vermont. That makes us different from Florida if you have a house in Florida. That is why we have high property taxes. And I really do believe that as a fundamental reality. I restate that because whenever we get to the point of education, I always hear people say things like, well, my kid's not in the district, why am I paying school taxes? Well, then why are you paying for fire services? You haven't had a fire call.
I don't think that the questioner meant that, George. I might be wrong.
Do me a favor. I didn't reference that to Carol.
No.
I referenced that on the general point. So it wasn't my comment to
All right.
Carol. It was my general point that I wanted to make.
Okay.
My turn? Yeah. You want me to say my name? Bruce Northrup is my name, from the town of Mamroneck. I have a question for Senator Latimer. George, as you know, many states are far ahead of New York in terms of requiring that their departments of state government set goals and objectives, which they then measure on a performance basis. They collect the metrics, and they publish them for the citizens. The last time I checked, the state of New York was one of the 3 worst in the country in terms of the transparency of what the state does and its accountability to its citizens. Now, I know you were looking at, we've talked about this before, you were looking at implementing something like that on a statewide basis to give us something more to go on, and I just wonder if there's been any progress on that.
I'd say no, Bruce, unfortunately. And when we had your initiative, as you highlighted your work in Washington State, we brought that available to the administration of that day. It's not the same administration as today, and we did not get a warm response. I'm going to repeat what you all realize. There is a gap between the legislative branch and the executive branch. You learned that in 4th grade. But in the town government, the town administrator is the executive, and he directly does what he is instructed to do by the legislative body, which is the supervisor of the town council. When you get to the higher levels of government, it is a gap between an executive and a legislative branch. We passed a law this year, which I sponsored in my house and was sponsored in the other house by Brian Kavanaugh from Manhattan, which required certain strategic plans to be shared with the legislature, and that was vetoed, because the executive branch chose not to, they chose what, as they viewed it, was not necessary, and that it was an infringement upon the executive prerogative by the legislative. So I think sometimes when you see things as you describe within an administrative function within the government, the problem isn't necessarily that people don't see it. It is that and the legislative branch can be prickly too about its prerogatives, and the judicial branch can be prickly about its prerogatives. But it is a battle of governmental turf more than it is a recognition that, yes, we have places to go. You're right, we have a long way to go in terms of modernizing the way we do our business. There have been some improvements, but we got a long way to go, and I freely admit that that's a weakness in the state government.
Thank you. In order that we not be leaving in the dark, we only have time for one more question so that we can close at 9:30. Is there anyone who has a question on something that hasn't been touched upon yet that is of particular concern? No.
May I ask a question of my fellow panel members?
I'm sorry?
May I ask a question of my fellow panel members?
Please do.
I'm just wondering what your feeling is. Do you two state elected officials and you other ladies who deal with Albany all the time, do you have a sense that there's any unanimity of thought in the legislature or the executive branch on the sense of mandate relief as being anything that anybody cares about other than us in suburbia? I mean, do you get anything from the poor people in the southern tier or in the North Country or the people in the cities that they're interested in any way or think that it would advance the interest of their constituents to have mandate relief?
Is there any unanimity? In my opinion, absolutely not. This is a debatable point between people who have different interests. If you try to analyze what's going on in Brooklyn or in Rye Brook or in a brook alongside the Adirondack, you'll get 3 different points of view as to what New York State ought to be doing. What I would say is this. If you look at a high-profile issue, controversial issue, marriage equality, gay marriage, if you will. Gay marriage happened because the people that were most affected by it were driven to drive and change the policy. When we talk about mandate relief, we do not get that kind of energy and drive and constant sense that the frustration over property taxes is tremendous, but it doesn't manifest itself in support this particular action to lower my taxes. And I think Barbara spoke about it better than I did, but until we figure out, Valerie, how to make this not about the local governments, but about the individuals, and you make that correlation between what you pay in taxes and what bills will help you solve that problem, we're not going to be able to bridge those differences where other parts of the state don't feel the problems that we feel in the suburbs.
And as all you have to do is just read the paper to know. I mean, there's a dichotomy between union interests, public employee interests, trade union interests. I mean, all of those things come to bear in Albany. And again, they put a lot of money into making sure that their interests are protected, whether it's the Wicks law, whether it's the Taylor law, whether you name it. And there is an interest in Albany that has usually money behind it that will make sure that their interests are protected. So you have to, as George said with marriage equality, that was kind of, it took them a long time. I'm not saying it was an easy argument, but it was a yes or no. Do you think there should be or shouldn't there be? Mandate relief encompasses so much between the schools and what the counties pay, and the governor now, after our task force went defunct, we issued a report, and actually the only thing we were able to do was some efficiencies within the government that the executive branch could do without getting the legislative branch involved. So it was mostly efficiencies of state agencies. However, now there is a new task force, which is much smaller, has some of the main interests around the table, that is ongoing. Hopefully next year is an election year. If the public decides they want to make a big issue, if the press decides that this is an issue that the public that they represent in their areas care about, you can create that momentum, but it has to be, this is something that's going to have to come from the people who are mostly impacted, and that's you, the taxpayer.
You go first.
To add to that, and I gave everybody a handout on some data and some other things around the mandates. But one thing that I think is relevant to this question that's in the handout has to do with exactly what Barb was just talking about, and that is that until people really feel, I'll use the word pain, and that's probably not the right word, but discomfort, or that something that they really have taken for granted is changing, that's when people are really going to come forward. So, for example, if you look at the tax levy limit, if you look at that data, in 2008, when the economy tanked, school districts in our area, we did 2% on average, and we did it every year going forward. We didn't need the tax levy limit. We were able to figure out what needed to be done. We know our communities. So when the tax levy limit came forward, and everybody up in Albany said, and it's going to be tied to mandate relief, pass it and mandate relief will come, we said, and I have to tell you, George did not vote for it, if mandate relief was so easy, we would have gotten it already. So why will it suddenly be tied to this levy limit? And of course, it wasn't. So now as you see municipal services getting cut, school programs being cut, staffing being cut, look around in some of particularly the higher needs districts that don't have athletics, don't have sports going on, don't have extracurricular, that have guidance counselor ratios that are just untenable, no social services, arts are gone, music is gone. That's, as you start to see these things going away, and programs that are really important and should be there for our kids, that's when you're going to see people start to really feel, I need to speak out and make a difference. And that's when the voters really say, this is not what we want, this is, something has to be done. Then you become a stronger special interest than the special interest, because you have the special interest of the vote.
Thank you. I hate to cut this off, but in reintroducing Elaine Chapnick, I would just like to thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this, and thank this wonderful committee for putting this together. This was truly illuminating. Ms. Chapnick?
felt I didn't have to go clear up on the stage again. I just wanted to also thank our moderator and all the panelists.
Oh, absolutely.
I want to thank our moderator and all the panelists tonight and the public that have asked some very interesting questions as well. I also want to thank LMC-TV for taping this very interesting and informative session tonight as well. I want to remind everybody to return those slips that you were given so that we have that information. I also want to share with you that our next local summit meeting is on October 19th, Tuesday the 19th at 7:45 at the Nautilus Diner.
November.
What
Excuse
did I
me,
say?
November.
November 19th. We just left October, didn't we? Well, anyway, November 19th at 7:45 at the Nautilus Diner, where we will have a panel discussing identity theft. Thank you all for coming.
That's scary.
Pardon me? I did.